In the heart of a fierce snowstorm, a German shepherd named Haven fights against the brutal cold, her every step a battle for survival. Clutched in her mouth, a tiny, lifeless puppy struggles to hold on to its fading heartbeat. Despite her exhaustion, her bond with her pup drives her to find shelter, a place of warmth where hope flickers like the faintest light through the swirling snow. What happens when this devoted mother reaches her limit? And who will answer her silent call? Watch the full video to discover the extraordinary lengths Haven will go to for love and survival. A fierce snowstorm blanketed the landscape of Flathead, Montana, turning the world into a swirling mass of white. The wind howled like a wild animal sweeping across the pines with an icy bite. The lake, usually calm, was now a slate-gray sheet of water churning violently under the weight of the storm. As the sky darkened, the relentless blizzard showed no signs of letting up, only intensifying. Amid the howling winds and blinding snow, a lone figure limped through the deepening snowdrifts. Haven, a German shepherd mother, moved steadily forward. Her thin body covered in ice and mud, her fur matted with frost. Every step was a struggle, each breath labored and shallow. Her sides heaved with the effort, yet she never slowed her pace. In her mouth she carried a small, lifeless puppy, its tiny form limp and cold, its heartbeat fading. The puppy, once lively and strong, was now a mere shadow of itself, clinging to the last remnants of life. Despite her own injuries, her paws raw and her body battered, Haven pressed on, driven by a force far greater than the storm. She could feel the weight of her exhaustion pulling her down, but the memory of a warm, safe place kept her moving. Her body screamed for rest, but the strength of her bond with the tiny pup in her mouth was enough to keep her going. Her love for the little one gave her a reason to fight against the storm, to battle through the cold that threatened to claim her. The wind whipped through her fur, causing her to shiver, but Haven pushed forward, her eyes locked ahead, her focus unwavering. She knew she had to find shelter soon, or they both would be lost. The snow piled higher around her as she trudged on the storm's fury, relentless. Yet through the chaos of the storm she remembered something, a distant memory that brought a spark of hope to her exhausted mind. Haven remembered a small workshop by Flathead Lake. The scent of cedar and the warmth of the light had called to her once before, a place where safety had been promised. The human there had smelled of warmth, protection, and security. It was her only chance, the only place where she could find help, and she would get there, no matter the cost. Every step she took brought her closer to that memory. Her journey through the storm felt endless, but Haven held on, driven by a mother's love, the hope of safety for her child, and the image of the human who had once shown her kindness. The wind howled around her, the snow stinging her face, but Haven remained determined. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she saw it. Through the storm's veil, a faint light shining through the swirling snow. It was a small workshop, the warmth of its light cutting through the cold like a beacon. She stumbled toward it, her body trembling, her strength nearly gone. As she reached the door, she set the puppy down gently on the ground, then sat back, her body rigid with duty. Inside, the faintest sound of a man working reached her ears, but she couldn't move anymore. She had made it. Now she could only wait. Joseph Ward sat alone in his cabin, a small weathered structure on the north shore of Flathead Lake. The storm outside raged with all the fury of winter's final breath, but inside the cabin was warm. The only sound, the rhythmic crackling of the fire. The faint scent of cedarwood lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of coffee that had long since gone cold. Joseph had been sitting by the fire, absent-mindedly working on a piece of wood, carving shapes out of the rough material that once held purpose, but now felt hollow. His life had become an endless cycle of solitude. At 41, he was a man who had seen too much, carried too many ghosts. The war in Afghanistan had taken much from him, and his youth, his peace, and most painfully his wife. The accident had been quick, 3 seconds that shattered everything. That night, the headlights of the oncoming truck had blinded her. The roads had been slick from rain, and before he could scream, she was gone. In that moment, the future had been stolen from him. There was no reason to fight anymore, no reason to stay connected to the world. His heart had grown numb. But the cabin, with its silence and its routine, had become his refuge. The wind howled outside, scraping the old cabin, and Joseph's thoughts drifted again to his wife, to the sound of her laughter, to the warmth she had once brought into this isolated place. Her absence was a void he couldn't fill, not with the work, not with the cold nights, and not with the memories of his military service. He didn't belong anywhere, not really. His hands worked automatically on the cedar board, smoothing it down with a plane. His mind wandered between the past and the present when he heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a scraping sound almost lost in the wind. But then it came again, urgent and unmistakable: scrape, pause, scrape, scrape. Joseph paused, his instincts as a Marine kicking in. His breath slowed as he listened carefully, letting the silence of the cabin guide him. He set the plane down on the bench and stood up. The sound was coming from outside. Carefully, Joseph moved toward the door, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He stood for a moment, his fingers on the latch, his mind racing. The storm was violent. What could it be? A stray animal. Someone lost in the snow. He opened the door cautiously, and the cold instantly hit him with the force of the storm. Snow swept inside the cabin, stinging his face. But there on the threshold stood a figure. A German shepherd, soaked to the bone, covered in mud, ice, and blood. The dog's body was thin ribs visible beneath its matted fur, and its eyes were sharp but full of pain. She looked up at him not with fear, but with a sense of duty. In her mouth she carried a small, lifeless puppy, its tiny body limp and still. The moment Joseph's gaze met the dog's, something passed between them, a silent understanding. The mother set the pup gently down on the doorstep, then took a step back. Sitting tall and still, her posture alert and unwavering. Joseph knelt, his eyes never leaving the dog. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no ordinary dog. There was something about her, something familiar, something disciplined. The way she carried herself, the way she stood guard, even now when she could barely stand, told him she wasn't just a stray. She had been trained. And she had a purpose. He reached out cautiously, his hand steady as he touched the puppy. It was cold, its tiny heart beating weakly under his fingertips. The pup was close to death, but there was still a flicker of life in it. Without hesitation, Joseph scooped the puppy up and wrapped it in his coat, feeling the cold chill seep through the fabric. The mother Haven didn't flinch. She watched him carefully, eyes fixed on the puppy, and then she followed him inside, not pushing, not demanding, but simply there, waiting, watching as though she knew he was the one who could help. Joseph closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel so alone. He set the puppy on the workbench and began to work quickly, warming rags by the stove and using them to heat the pup's body. The air in the cabin grew thick with the weight of the situation. Haven, meanwhile, stood nearby, still focused, as though her only concern was the well-being of her pup. Joseph's hands moved with the precision he had learned in the military, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew this dog had a story, one that mirrored his own, one that was written in the scars of war, in the sacrifices made, and in the loss that followed. As he worked to stabilize the puppy, Joseph's thoughts lingered on the bond he felt with Haven, a bond he couldn't explain. She wasn't just a dog. She was something more, something tied to a past he thought was long gone. Joseph moved swiftly around the cabin, keeping his focus on the puppy in his hands, but a nagging feeling crept up on him. As he warmed the rags by the stove, he couldn't help but glance at Haven, the mother who had silently followed him inside, standing still, her eyes always locked on her pup. Something about her felt different, but it wasn't just her presence in the room, it was her entire demeanor. As Joseph worked on the puppy, his hands steady and methodical, he noticed the way Haven held herself. She wasn't like other dogs he had encountered. She was poised calm, but there was a hidden intensity in her posture. The way her head was slightly cocked as she watched the puppy, the way she moved with purpose yet without rushing, it reminded him of something. Someone. His mind wandered back to his time in the military. There were moments when he would see soldiers trained to observe every detail, every movement. Haven had that same sense of discipline, that sharpness in her eyes. It wasn't just instinct, it was training. Military training. He paused for a moment, his breath catching as he looked at her more closely. As Haven shifted slightly, Joseph caught sight of several scars running across her neck and shoulder. Thin, faded lines as if etched into her skin by something sharp, something unnatural. They were too clean, too deliberate to be random injuries. They were battle wounds. Joseph felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a stray dog. Haven had been through something. Something far more than the typical hardships of a street dog. These scars weren't from the wild. They were from the kind of battles he knew all too well, the kind that left marks on both the body and the soul. He couldn't help but study her more closely. The scars, the tension in her muscles, the way she stood guard by the door, even now her posture one of vigilant waiting. It was as if she were on alert despite the safety of the cabin. There was a certain control in her movements, a precision in the way she shifted her weight as if trained to do so. Joseph's mind began to race. Could it be possible? Could Haven have been part of a K-9 unit? He had seen military working dogs in action before, dogs like Haven, loyal, strong, and unwavering. His chest tightened with realization. Haven wasn't just any dog. She had been trained. She had served. As he continued to care for the puppy, his thoughts drifted to Nathan, his fallen comrade, the one who had always said that the bond between a soldier and their dog was like no other. A bond of trust, of duty, of survival. They worked as one in sync, their lives intertwined. Nathan had always said that the dogs were more than tools in war. They were partners. The bond they shared went beyond the battlefield. Joseph's heart ached with the memory of his friend. Nathan had been the kind of man who gave everything, even his life, for others. And now Joseph saw that Haven had likely given everything too. She had survived, but for what? To find him. To find her purpose again. The realization hit him like a wave. The connection between them, the bond that had been forged in battle, in pain, in loyalty, was undeniable. Haven had brought the puppy to him for a reason, but there was something else at play here. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about redemption, about finding something lost, something both of them had been searching for. Joseph felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. He wasn't just caring for a dog, he was caring for a piece of his past, a past that had been buried under layers of grief and loss. And now with Haven in his care, that past had resurfaced, and with it the promise of healing. As Haven shifted again, her amber eyes locked onto his with a quiet understanding. There was no need for words between them. They both knew that their fates were now tied together. And Joseph, for the first time in a long while, felt a glimmer of hope. He would protect Haven and the puppy, but more than that, he would find out the truth about Haven's past, about who she truly was and what she had been through. Because somehow he knew it was all connected to his own journey of redemption. The soft crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the cabin as Joseph carefully worked to warm the tiny puppy. The little creature had been so close to death, but now as Joseph wrapped it in soft rags and set it gently near the stove, he could feel the faintest stir of life returning. The small chest rose and fell slowly, steadily. He had seen this before in war, in the quiet moments when a wounded soldier found the will to fight on. And now in this tiny body he saw the same spark, a will to survive, to fight to live. Joseph carefully checked the pup's body, monitoring its temperature, gently rubbing its small limbs to encourage circulation. The puppy's pulse was faint, but it was there. Every minute that passed brought more warmth to its cold body, and with each passing moment, Joseph felt the quiet, comforting realization that he was doing something good for the first time in a long while. His hands, though calloused and scarred from years of work and battle, were steady as he worked, moving with the precision of someone who had learned to be methodical, to save and to heal. As the puppy's color began to return, Joseph's thoughts drifted to Haven. She stood just inside the room, watching her posture still alert, her eyes following his every movement. It was as if she were guarding not just her pup, but him as well. And Joseph couldn't help but feel the weight of that gaze. Haven wasn't just any dog, she was a protector, a survivor, and somehow she had found her way to him. Hours passed in silence with only the soft sounds of the storm outside and the warmth of the fire to fill the cabin. The puppy was no longer trembling. It had settled into a deep, steady sleep, its tiny body curled up against the warmth of the stove. Haven remained by the door, her gaze never leaving the pup. She had been through so much, Joseph knew. Her body was worn, her spirit exhausted, but her eyes held something unbroken, something fierce, something undying. For the first time in months, Joseph felt something stir within him. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Haven and the puppy had become a part of him, part of a larger story he had been too afraid to face, a story of survival, of loss, of healing. He hadn't realized how deeply he had needed this, needed them until now. As the night wore on, Joseph set a small blanket near the fire and sat beside it. Haven hesitated for a moment before slowly making her way to the spot he had prepared. She lay down, curling up around the still sleeping puppy. Joseph, sensing her need for rest, sat quietly just watching. There was no need for words between them. In that moment, everything that had been unsaid between him and Haven was understood. The bond was stronger than any words could express. Joseph felt his own body relax for the first time in what seemed like years. The weight of his grief, the emptiness that had filled him since the loss of his wife, was no longer as heavy. The presence of Haven and her puppy had filled the void in ways he hadn't expected. It was subtle but profound. They had brought warmth, both physically and emotionally, to the cold, empty cabin. And in doing so, they had begun to heal something inside him that he hadn't even known was broken. In that quiet space with the fire flickering and the storm howling outside, Joseph knew one thing for certain. Haven and the puppy were not just creatures he had saved. They were saving him too. He leaned back against the wall, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him. The night stretched on, but for the first time in months, he felt at peace. The fire crackled steadily in the corner of the cabin, casting long shadows against the walls. Joseph sat silently, his eyes occasionally glancing over at Haven and the puppy, both resting peacefully by the warmth of the stove. Despite the serenity of the moment, his mind was still racing, drawn to a question that had been lingering since Haven had arrived. There was something about her, something that didn't sit right with the simple idea of her being just another stray dog. The more Joseph observed her, the more he began to notice the subtle but distinct signs that Haven was no ordinary dog. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but it was clear now. Haven was different. She was disciplined, strong, and reserved in a way that suggested training far beyond the basics of household behavior. The scars on her neck, which he had initially dismissed as the marks of a hard life, began to reveal a deeper story. As the fire flickered and the storm continued to rage outside, Joseph leaned forward, a sudden realization coming to him. He had seen those types of scars before. Deep, precise, and intentional. They weren't the marks of street fights or wild encounters. They were the kind of scars left by the kind of training that only military or specialized K-9 units endured. Joseph stood slowly and moved over to Haven, who was still curled around the puppy. She lifted her head as he approached but didn't move away. Her amber eyes locked onto his, filled with an intelligence that he had started to recognize. As he carefully ran his hand over the fur on her neck, he felt the slight ridge of a scar, long, smooth, and even. The fur here was thinner, the skin more worn, as if it had been rubbed against something much tougher than mere dirt or brush. The texture of the scar told him all he needed to know. Haven wasn't just any dog. She had been trained. She had been through something that only certain dogs, military working dogs, K-9 units, could endure. The realization hit Joseph with a sharpness that made his breath catch. Could Haven be one of the K-9s that had served alongside Nathan? His mind flashed back to his time in the military, to the bond he had shared with Nathan and the dogs they had worked with. Nathan had often talked about the bond between soldier and dog, how in some ways it was stronger than any human connection. They didn't just work together. They fought side by side, trusted each other with their lives. And Haven, this strong, quiet, disciplined dog, had all the signs of being part of that world. Joseph took a step back, his thoughts swirling. Haven hadn't just found him by chance. She had found him for a reason, and that reason was now clearer than ever. She had been part of Nathan's team, and somehow through everything, through the war, the loss, the distance, Haven had made her way back to him. But why? It wasn't just a random reunion. Haven had been sent to him guided by a force Joseph couldn't yet understand. The thought of Nathan lingered in his mind, and he felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of sadness and something else, something like gratitude. He hadn't expected to be brought back into that world, but here it was unfolding in front of him. Joseph moved to the window and looked out at the dark, swirling snow. The storm had calmed for now, but inside his emotions were a whirlwind. The discovery of Haven's past had opened a door, one he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. But there was no turning back now. He had to know more. He had to understand how Haven had found him and what it meant for his own healing. As he stood there staring out into the storm, the image of Nathan came to him once more. His friend had been a man of duty, of honor, of deep loyalty. And somehow, in a way Joseph couldn't yet explain, Nathan's legacy had found its way to him through Haven. It was a connection that ran deeper than any war story, deeper than any mission they had shared. Joseph stood by the window staring out at the storm's fading remnants. The dark sky hung low over Flathead Lake, the winds now whispering rather than howling. The cabin, still and quiet, seemed far removed from the chaos of the world outside. Yet inside, Joseph's thoughts were anything but calm. As he looked into the swirling snow, memories of Afghanistan flooded his mind. He could almost hear the roar of the Humvees, the sharp orders being shouted in the midst of the chaos, the feeling of weightlessness when the ground seemed to tremble beneath him. But most of all, he could hear Nathan's voice, the calm, steady voice that always seemed to cut through the chaos, keeping him grounded. Nathan had been more than a friend. He had been a brother. They had served together in some of the harshest conditions, their bond forged in fire and blood. The long, grueling days spent navigating dangerous terrains, the nights huddled together around a small fire in the mountains, talking about their families, their hopes, and the life they'd come home to. Nathan's laughter, his quick wit, had always been there to lighten the darkest moments, and his fierce loyalty was something Joseph had never questioned. But it wasn't just the good times that bonded them, it was the sacrifices they had made for each other. They had both seen horrors, the kinds of things that stayed with you long after the dust settled. Nathan had been the one who pulled him out of harm's way when the explosion hit their convoy. It had been a split-second decision. Nathan had shoved Joseph to the ground, taking the brunt of the blast himself. The impact had left Nathan scarred physically and emotionally, but it hadn't broken him. He had always been the one to rise, to fight, to give everything for the mission, for the team. Joseph felt the sting of that memory again. Nathan had saved him, but he hadn't made it out of that ambush. The explosion had taken Nathan from him, leaving a hole in Joseph's chest that had never fully healed. But now, with Haven in his life, the weight of that loss seemed a little lighter. It was as if Nathan's presence had returned to him in a different form. Haven was no longer just a dog. She was a living connection to Nathan, a reminder of everything Joseph had lost and everything he still had to fight for. Joseph turned away from the window, his heart heavy with the memories, but also with a sense of purpose. Haven had found him for a reason. She wasn't just a dog who had wandered into his life. She was a part of something bigger, something that tied back to Nathan. Joseph could feel it deep in his bones. Haven wasn't just here to heal the puppy. She was here to heal him too, to bring him back to life just as Nathan had once done, by showing him the strength to keep going. He walked over to the workbench where the puppy still lay curled up, its tiny body warming slowly. Haven was standing by the door, watching him intently, her eyes soft but filled with something else, something familiar. She was waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to recognize the truth of her past. Joseph sank into the chair next to the workbench and closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of everything he had experienced pressing down on him. He could still hear Nathan's voice in his head, a quiet reminder to keep pushing forward, to never give up. He had to keep fighting. For Nathan, for Haven, for the future. As Joseph sat there, the storm outside seemed to grow quieter, the world outside fading into the background. His thoughts were on the past, on Nathan, but also on Haven and the future. He knew that this wasn't just a random encounter. Haven had brought him something he hadn't known he needed, a second chance, a chance to heal, a chance to move forward. Joseph stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Haven. She remained still, as if sensing the shift in the air around them, her body tense with quiet anticipation. The cabin had grown warmer with the fire's light, but there was still a lingering chill that seemed to press in on him. It was as though the past had settled into the room, its presence unmistakable. His gaze drifted to the small wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. It had been there for years, tucked away in the same spot where he had left it after returning from the war. Inside it held memories. Old photographs, medals, and keepsakes of the life he once had. He had never opened it after Nathan's death. The chest had become a grave for the past, a place to bury the painful remnants of the man he had been. But now, as he looked at Haven, the realization hit him. She was connected to that past. She wasn't just a dog he had found in the storm. She was a part of something far deeper, something that had been left unfinished. He had to know more. Joseph crossed the room and knelt beside the chest. He opened it slowly, the hinges creaking as if protesting the disturbance. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out an old leather-bound folder, the kind Nathan always kept his notes and letters in. The folder had been buried under a pile of other mementos, but this one felt different, almost as if it were calling to him. Joseph flipped it open, and there, wedged between two faded pages, was a letter. He recognized Nathan's handwriting immediately, sharp, precise, and full of purpose. His heart clenched as he unfolded the paper, the edges worn and yellowed with age. The letter read, "Joseph, if you're reading this, it means I've gone. But Haven will still be with you. If she survives, she will bring something to you that I never could. She is more than just a dog. She is the promise I made to you, the bond we shared, and the loyalty we swore to one another. I know this isn't the end for you. It's just the beginning. Take care of her. She will help you find the way back. She will bring back something I couldn't finish, your strength, your purpose. If you find her, then you know you're not alone. I'll be with you through her. Nathan." Joseph's breath caught as he read the words, each sentence heavier than the last. He couldn't believe it. Nathan had known. He had known that Haven would find her way to him, that she would become a part of his life in a way he could never have imagined. The letter was a message not just from Nathan, but from the past, the part of him Joseph had tried so hard to bury. Haven had been more than just a companion. She had been sent to fulfill a promise, to bring him back from the darkness he had been living in. As the words settled in, a flood of emotion overwhelmed Joseph. The grief, the pain of losing Nathan, the guilt of surviving when his friend hadn't, all came rushing back. His throat tightened as he folded the letter and clutched it to his chest. The weight of it all was unbearable, but at the same time it gave him a sense of clarity. Nathan had entrusted him with something precious, something that could help him find his way again. Tears blurred his vision as he looked down at Haven, still lying by the fire, her eyes steady on him. She was waiting for him to understand. She wasn't just here to protect her pup. She had been sent to protect him, to guide him. Joseph wiped his eyes and stood up, the letter still in his hands. He wasn't alone. He had Haven, and together they would face whatever came next. He would honor Nathan's memory, and he would protect Haven. Not just because she had saved the puppy, but because she had come to save him too. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within Joseph was far from over. The weight of the past had returned, and with it the fear that he wasn't ready to face it. But he would. For Nathan, for Haven, and for himself. The night had settled into an eerie silence, the kind that blankets the world after a storm has passed. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, and Haven was curled up by the stove. her body still and peaceful, her amber eyes half closed in quiet contentment. Joseph stood in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hands, trying to collect his thoughts after the flood of emotions he'd just experienced. The letter from Nathan had stirred something deep inside him, a realization that Haven was here for a purpose and that he was no longer the man he had been when he came to this cabin. He had a reason to fight again, a reason to heal. But just as Joseph thought he could finally breathe, something shifted in the room. A faint sound, a low scrape of claws against wood, broke the stillness, and before he could even react, Haven was gone. His heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the door, calling her name, but the cabin was silent. His mind raced. The storm had just passed. There was no reason for her to go out into the cold again. Panic surged in his chest as he grabbed his jacket, pulling it on quickly, not even thinking. He had to find her. The wind still whipped through the trees outside, the snow still falling in thick, heavy sheets. The world was a blur of white, a swirling chaos that felt like nature itself was closing in. Joseph stood at the threshold of the door, his breath visible in the frigid air, his heart pounding in his ears. Haven had been right here just moments ago, curled up by the fire, her presence solid and comforting. Now she was gone. He stepped into the storm, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, and called her name into the night. No response. The storm seemed to swallow his voice, and the world around him grew even more desolate. Joseph's mind flashed back to his time in the military. He'd seen soldiers disappear in the chaos of battle, no warning, no chance to call out, but this was different. This was Haven. She had been here for him. She couldn't have just left. His mind raced, the fear growing as he trudged through the snow. What if something had happened to her? What if she was in danger? Haven had never shown any sign of fear, but in the storm's grip, anything was possible. After what felt like an eternity of searching, Joseph finally spotted a shadow in the distance. Through the flurry of snow, he saw Haven's figure moving steadily through the snow, her body low to the ground, her focus sharp. She wasn't running from something, she was heading towards something. Joseph followed her, his heart still pounding with worry, but something in his chest began to settle. Haven wasn't lost. She was on a mission. She was going somewhere important. The storm began to ease as they moved deeper into the woods, the trees thinning until they came to an old abandoned building, its sagging roof covered in snow, the windows dark and empty. Haven stopped just outside, her head held high, her eyes scanning the area. Joseph approached slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air, and watched as Haven moved toward the door. She paused for a moment, then nudged it open with her nose. Inside, Joseph's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The sight before him stopped him in his tracks. There, huddled in a corner of the abandoned house, were 3 tiny figures. 3 more puppies, their fur matted with dirt and ice, their tiny bodies trembling. Haven immediately stepped forward, her body blocking Joseph's view of them, and she lay down beside them. Her eyes were soft but resolute as she nudged one of the puppies closer to her body, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of her maternal duty. Joseph stood still for a moment, his mind racing. Haven hadn't come out here just to find shelter. She had known these puppies were here. She had been looking for them just as she'd carried her own pup to safety. This was her mission. This was what she had been trained to do. The realization hit Joseph hard. Haven wasn't just a dog who had wandered into his life. She was a protector, a survivor, and now she had found him for a reason. She had found him to complete something that neither she nor Nathan had finished. Joseph stood frozen for a moment, his breath catching as he took in the sight of the 3 puppies huddled in the corner of the abandoned house. Haven had found them. She had brought them here to this forgotten place in search of safety. The storm outside had taken its toll on everyone, but Haven had pushed through the cold, the exhaustion, and the isolation all for them. It wasn't just the puppy she had carried back to the cabin. It was a family. A family she had fought for, and now it was his turn to fight for them. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. Haven looked up at him, her amber eyes still fierce despite the weariness that clung to her. She didn't need to speak for him to understand. She wasn't just a dog, she was a protector, a mother, and now she was depending on him. Joseph kneeled beside Haven, gently touching the smallest puppy which had curled up beside her. Its tiny body was stiff with cold, and it whimpered softly as he touched it. He could feel its frail body trembling beneath his fingers. The others were no better off. All of them were exhausted, barely clinging to life. He knew they wouldn't last much longer out here. He had a choice to make. He couldn't leave them here, not after everything Haven had done to keep them alive. He knew what he had to do. Taking a deep breath, Joseph carefully scooped up the 3 puppies one by one and cradled them against his chest. They were fragile, no more than a few weeks old, but he could feel the faintest spark of life in them. They were still fighting to survive. Haven had done all she could, but now it was his turn. Haven stood slowly and moved to follow him, but her movements were sluggish, her steps heavy with exhaustion. Joseph glanced at her and felt his heart tighten. She was pushing herself beyond her limits for them, her pups, and now for him. But it was clear. She wasn't going to make it much longer without rest. He could see it in the way she was dragging her right rear paw and the way she struggled to maintain her balance. As Joseph moved back towards the door, ready to take the puppies back to the safety of the cabin, Haven followed behind him one step at a time. Her determination was unwavering, but Joseph could see how difficult it was for her. The storm had drained her both physically and emotionally, and yet she continued forward, her eyes fixed on her pups, watching over them even in her own pain. The cold wind hit them again as they stepped out of the building, the snow falling faster now. Joseph's breath came out in visible puffs as he tried to shield the puppies from the storm. His heart raced as he made his way back through the snow, his mind focused on getting them all back to the warmth of the cabin. But as they reached the edge of the clearing, Haven collapsed. Her body gave way beneath her, and she crumpled into the snow with a soft grunt. Joseph's heart leapt in his chest, and he immediately knelt beside her. The puppies squirmed weakly in his arms, but he couldn't focus on them for the moment. "Haven," he whispered, gently brushing the snow from her fur. Her body was cold, and her breathing shallow. She looked up at him with those intelligent eyes still filled with resolve. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. But Joseph knew. This wasn't just exhaustion. Haven had given everything she had to bring these puppies to safety, and now it was his turn to carry the weight. He gently placed the puppies down in the snow, pulling Haven close to him. With every ounce of strength he had left, he lifted her into his arms, determined to get them all back to the cabin. Haven rested her head against his chest, her body trembling. Joseph could feel the warmth of her body fading, but he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when Haven had sacrificed so much. He couldn't let her down. The journey back to the cabin was slower this time. The storm raged on, but Joseph pushed through it, determined to make it. The weight of the puppies in his arms felt like nothing compared to the weight of his responsibility. And as he trudged through the snow, Haven in his arms, he couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning of their journey. They were survivors. And together, they would make it through. Joseph's legs were burning with exhaustion, each step through the thick snow feeling like an eternity. The wind whipped against his face, but it barely registered in his mind. His thoughts were focused entirely on Haven, who rested quietly in his arms. Her body trembled lightly, the warmth she had once carried slowly fading. He could feel it, her strength, her vitality slipping away. But Joseph refused to stop. He couldn't. Not when Haven had given everything she had for the puppies for him. Not when she had come this far, guiding him back to life in ways he didn't fully understand. The snow around him seemed endless, a cold and empty world. But in his arms, Haven and the puppies were a reminder of the warmth he'd lost, and the warmth he still had the chance to find. He had carried the weight of loss for so long, locked away in his own grief and isolation. He had been a man who had retreated into the quiet, thinking he could move on from the past, but Haven had shattered that solitude. She had brought him a reason to fight again. Joseph's heart ached with the thought of how much Haven had endured. The scars on her body, the way she had pushed herself to the limit for those puppies for him, it wasn't just the bond of a pet and owner. It was a deep, primal connection, something born from survival, from duty, from loyalty. This was more than a dog. She was a warrior, a soldier in her own right. She had carried more than just the weight of the puppies. She had carried the memories of the war, of battles fought, and of promises made. As he walked, the snow now settling around him in thick drifts, Joseph realized just how much Haven had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a companion. She was his bridge to the past, to the man he had been, to the memories of Nathan and the things that had been left unsaid. Haven had been sent to him to finish something he had never expected. She had carried the weight of her own grief and loss, just like him. But she had also brought him something more, a purpose, a chance for redemption, and a reminder that he wasn't alone. The puppies in his arms shifted slightly, their small bodies warm and alive against his chest. He could feel their fragile hearts beating in rhythm with his own, and it filled him with a sense of responsibility he hadn't known he had left in him. These tiny creatures had no choice in the world they were born into. They had no choice but to rely on him, just as Haven had relied on him to bring them to safety. He wasn't just saving them. They were saving him too. They were bringing him back from the darkness. As Joseph reached the cabin, the door creaked open, and the warmth inside hit him like a wave. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him to shut out the storm. His heart was still pounding, but the heavy weight of grief and loss that had followed him for so long felt just a little lighter. He set Haven down gently near the fire, the puppies still nestled in his arms, and crouched beside her. She lifted her head slightly, meeting his gaze with those steady amber eyes. There was no need for words between them. Joseph could see it in her eyes. Haven was telling him that she was ready to rest. She had done her duty. She had brought them here, and now it was his turn to protect her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Joseph didn't feel so alone. He was no longer the man who had buried himself in grief. He was no longer the man who had shut himself off from the world. He had a purpose again. He had Haven and her puppies. He had a reason to keep moving forward. He reached down and gently ran his fingers through Haven's fur, feeling the heat from her body, the steady rise and fall of her chest. His fingers brushed over the scars on her neck, and he realized in that moment that he was not just caring for her. He was honoring her. He was honoring the life she had lived and the mission she had completed. And he was ready to start the next chapter not alone, but with her and the puppies by his side. The days that followed were filled with the quiet rhythm of life, a rhythm Joseph hadn't known in a long time. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that shimmered under the pale light of the sun. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, its warmth filling the room. But it wasn't just the fire that warmed Joseph now. It was the life in the room, the fragile but determined heartbeat of the puppies and the steady presence of Haven beside him. The puppies were slowly recovering, their tiny bodies still fragile but growing stronger with each passing hour. Joseph had made a routine of tending to them, feeding them, wrapping them in warm cloths, and making sure their tiny bodies stayed protected from the cold. They were still weak, but the spark of life that had once been so faint was now growing brighter. The steady rhythm of their breathing was a small but sure sign that they were fighting to survive. Joseph had been working with a focus he hadn't felt in years. Each task, each bottle of milk he prepared, each cloth he warmed by the stove, each soft word he whispered to the puppies was a reminder of his purpose. He wasn't just saving them. He was healing himself, just as he was healing Haven and her pups. Haven remained beside him, always present, always vigilant. She would lie near the puppies, her body still, her eyes watching them carefully. Her once sharp focus had softened a little, but Joseph could see it in her eyes. She was still dedicated to her pups, still the protector, still the guardian. But there was something more now. something Joseph couldn't quite explain. A quiet acceptance, a sense of peace. He had been giving Haven the care she so desperately needed, but she wasn't healing as quickly as the puppies. She was still weak, still recovering from the toll the journey had taken on her body. The exhaustion had drained her, and Joseph could see the lingering weariness in the way she moved. She had given everything for her pups, and now it was his turn to give back. The weight of the responsibility felt heavy, but Joseph knew he couldn't back down. He had made a promise, not just to Haven, but to Nathan as well. Nathan had entrusted Haven to him, and Joseph couldn't ignore the sense of duty that ran through his veins just as it had in the military. He had to protect them. It wasn't just about saving a dog and her puppies. It was about honoring a promise made in the heat of battle, in the midst of loss, and in the quiet moments of camaraderie. The bond between Joseph and Haven had grown deeper in the past few days, and with each passing hour he found himself more determined to fulfill Nathan's unspoken wish. He wasn't going to let them down. He couldn't. Not after everything Haven had done, not after the sacrifices she had made. She had carried those puppies to him just as Nathan had carried him through the darkest moments of their deployment. Now it was his turn to be the protector. As Joseph sat by the fire, his thoughts turning to Nathan, he made a promise to himself. He would protect Haven and the puppies. He would give them everything he had, just as Nathan had given everything to him. This was his mission now, to give them a second chance at life, to honor Nathan's memory, and to fulfill the promise that had been left unfinished. He looked down at Haven, who had lifted her head slightly, her amber eyes meeting his. There was a softness there, a quiet understanding that passed between them. She had done her part. Now it was his turn. As the days passed, Joseph's connection with Haven grew stronger, deeper. The weight of the promise he had made to both Haven and Nathan settled heavily in his chest, but it was not a burden. It was a calling. And as much as he focused on caring for the puppies, on keeping them alive and warm, Haven had become his focus as well. He had been treating Haven like a wounded companion, but the more time he spent with her, the more Joseph began to realize that she was not just an ordinary dog. He had seen dogs with incredible loyalty and intelligence in his time in the military, but there was something different about Haven. Her instincts were sharp, her movements deliberate, and there was an unmistakable discipline in the way she carried herself. One afternoon, while Joseph was working on repairing a broken chair, he noticed Haven standing by the window, her eyes scanning the outside world with a focus that could not be mistaken. She was poised, alert, her body tense with quiet strength. Joseph paused, watching her. She had been lying still for most of the day, but something had caught her attention. Without a word, Haven stood and walked to the door. Joseph followed, his curiosity piqued. Haven stopped just outside the door, her eyes trained on something in the distance. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She simply waited, her posture strong and focused. Then she moved. Every step was precise, controlled, and Joseph was struck by the sense of purpose she carried with each motion. As Haven moved through the snow, Joseph couldn't help but compare her to the military K-9s he had worked with during his time in Afghanistan. There was the same sense of discipline in her, the same calm authority. But Haven wasn't just a dog trained to perform tasks. She was trained for survival. She had the instincts of a soldier who knew how to move quietly, how to read the environment, how to trust and follow orders. She wasn't just reacting to her surroundings, she was leading, commanding, guiding. The realization hit him like a wave. Haven had been through the same kind of training he had known, the same kind of bond formed between handler and K-9. She had been a working dog in the field, trained to survive the harshest conditions, to fight alongside her handler, and to follow through on missions no matter the cost. Joseph had no doubt in his mind now. Haven wasn't just a rescue dog, she was a soldier in her own right, and the scars on her body told the story of a warrior. He stood for a moment, watching her as she surveyed the area, every muscle in her body tense, waiting. He couldn't help but feel a deep respect for her, an admiration that went beyond the simple affection he had for the dog. Haven wasn't just a dog trying to survive. She was a survivor in her own right, and her strength was something that inspired him more than he had expected. As Haven turned back toward him, her eyes meeting his with that same quiet understanding, Joseph felt a deep connection with her. He wasn't alone in this fight. Haven had fought her own battles, and now they were in this together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Joseph couldn't help but smile. Haven had shown him what strength truly meant. It wasn't just about physical power, it was about resilience, about the ability to endure, to keep moving forward despite everything that tried to hold you back. And in that moment, he realized that Haven wasn't just helping him heal. She was teaching him how to fight again. The days blurred together as Joseph settled into his new rhythm, caring for Haven and the puppies. The simple tasks that had once seemed tedious, feeding, cleaning, tending to the fire, now felt purposeful, each one a small step towards something greater. He woke early each morning, his eyes meeting Haven's steady gaze, and he knew that the routine they had built together was more than just survival. It was healing for both of them. As Haven and the puppies grew stronger each day, Joseph began to see a change in himself. He had come to this cabin hoping for solitude, hoping to escape the ghosts of his past, but what he had found instead was a sense of belonging, of purpose. Caring for Haven and her pups had become more than just a task. It had become his reason to move forward, his reason to keep fighting against the grief that had weighed him down for so long. The cabin, which had once felt so empty, was now filled with life. The puppies, once fragile and weak, now played and tumbled together, their tiny barks and the soft thudding of their paws a constant reminder of the second chance at life they had been given. Haven's maternal instincts were sharp, her protective nature unwavering, and Joseph couldn't help but admire her strength. In her, he saw a reflection of his own struggle to overcome the past, to find meaning again. And slowly, very slowly, he began to feel that Haven was doing more than just filling the emptiness around him. She was helping him find his way back. She had become his anchor, the one thing that kept him grounded in a world that felt too vast and uncertain. The weight of his grief had begun to lift piece by piece, replaced by the quiet purpose of caring for them all. There were still moments when the past crept into his mind. The memories of Nathan, of the war, of the pain and loss that had followed him for so long, but they didn't feel as overwhelming anymore. They were just memories, not chains. And whenever the darkness seemed to rise again, Joseph would look over at Haven, and he would feel that quiet strength, that steady resolve, and he would remember that they were in this together. One evening, as the fire flickered softly, Joseph sat by the window, watching the snow fall gently outside. The world was quiet again, the storm having passed, and for the first time in a long time, Joseph felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting. It was the kind of peace that came from acceptance. He had lost so much in his life, but here in this small cabin with Haven and her pups by his side, he had found something worth fighting for again. He smiled as the puppies nuzzled against their mother, their tiny bodies curling up close to her warmth. The sound of their soft breathing filled the room, and for the first time since he had arrived, Joseph allowed himself to believe in something more than just survival. He believed in the small miracles that life had to offer. Haven had come into his life when he had least expected it, and now she had brought him back to life in ways he couldn't explain. Maybe, just maybe, he thought as he watched Haven carefully lick the fur of one of her pups, there was something bigger at work here, something that he hadn't seen before. The bond he shared with Haven was not just about saving them, it was about finding purpose again. And in that purpose, he had found a piece of himself he thought had been lost forever. Joseph had found something worth fighting for once more. He wasn't just caring for a dog and her puppies, he was living again. Joseph had never expected to hear from Nathan again. The bond they had shared in the military was as deep as any friendship could be, but it had always felt like a bond tied to the past, a bond that had been severed with Nathan's death. For years, Joseph had carried the weight of that loss alone, never daring to believe that any part of his old life could ever come back. But now, in the quiet peace of the cabin with Haven and the puppies by his side, Joseph felt something shift within him. He felt the pull of something unfinished, something that had been left behind and needed to be completed. It was a cold morning when the letter arrived. Joseph had just finished tending to the puppies, their small bodies growing stronger each day. He had been feeling more connected to them than he ever thought possible, watching them grow and develop in ways that seemed miraculous. The healing process was slow but steady, and the warmth of their presence filled the cabin in a way that brought him a quiet comfort. But on this morning, something new arrived, something that would change everything. The letter was marked with the insignia of the military, the familiar logo of the K-9 registry that Joseph hadn't seen in years. His heart skipped a beat as he held the envelope in his hands. For a moment, he hesitated. He knew what the letter meant. He could feel it in his gut. The same feeling that had settled in when Haven had walked into his life, when he had first discovered the scars on her body and realized who she truly was. This letter would confirm everything he had feared and hoped for. He opened the envelope slowly, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the letter inside. The words were sharp, direct, as they always had been with Nathan. But this time, the words were different. They carried weight, a finality that Joseph wasn't prepared for. Joseph, if you're reading this, it means Haven has survived and you've kept her safe. She's completed her mission, the one I never could finish. She's been your guide, your protector, your partner. The bond we shared on soldier to soldier, handler to K-9, isn't something that dies. It lives on in Haven. She's done what we couldn't do. She's made sure you aren't alone. You don't need to carry the past anymore, my friend. It's time to move forward. She's there for you. She always was. Joseph's eyes blurred with tears as he read the letter. The words, simple and straightforward, hit him like a punch to the gut. Haven had completed her mission. She had fulfilled the unspoken promise Nathan had made to him. He had spent years carrying the weight of that promise alone, but now, with Haven beside him, he realized it had all come full circle. Nathan was right. Haven had been sent to him to protect him, to heal him, just as Nathan had once done in the heat of battle. The grief that Joseph had carried so heavily for years felt lighter now, as if the burden had been shared between him and Haven. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone all this time. He folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking, and placed it gently on the table. The air in the cabin felt different now. It wasn't just the warmth of the fire or the soft, rhythmic breathing of the puppies that filled the room. It was the weight of a promise fulfilled, of a mission completed, and of a new beginning. Haven walked over to Joseph, her eyes soft but knowing. She nudged his hand gently with her nose, as if to say, I've done my part. Now it's your turn. Joseph smiled through the tears that welled up in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. He knew what he had to do next. The fire crackled in the corner of the cabin, casting flickering shadows across the room. Joseph sat silently at the table, the letter from Nathan resting in front of him. Haven lay by his feet, her head resting on her paws, her amber eyes following every movement he made. The puppies slept soundly in their corner, their tiny bodies curled together for warmth. But even in the calm of the cabin, Joseph knew the work wasn't finished. Haven had done her part. She had carried her pups through a storm, found her way to him, and brought them back to life. Now it was his turn to finish what they had started, to find the others. The puppies that Haven had nurtured in the wilderness before they arrived. Joseph had spent days searching the area near the cabin, combing through the surrounding woods and abandoned buildings. Haven had led him to the 3 puppies she had found, but Joseph felt certain there were more. She had been out there for days before coming to him, her instincts driving her to protect every pup she could find. And Joseph wasn't about to stop until he knew that every one of them was safe. The thought of those tiny creatures, still so fragile, so dependent, kept him going. He had promised Haven he would protect them just as Nathan had promised to protect him. And now he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. With a determined breath, Joseph stood up from the table, pushing the chair back. He crossed the room to Haven, crouching beside her. She lifted her head and looked at him, her gaze steady. He placed a hand on her head, his fingers brushing through her fur. "We're going to find them," he said softly, though he knew she understood without words. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his heart. The search wasn't over, and he wasn't going to stop until Haven had her full family. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy with snow, and the ground beneath his boots was slippery. Joseph knew the journey would be hard, but the idea of stopping, of letting them stay out there alone in the cold, was not an option. Haven had already fought too hard. Now it was his turn to carry the weight of their future. He stepped outside Haven, following him closely, her eyes still alert, her tail held high. She had regained some strength, but there was still a weariness to her movements. He didn't rush her. Instead, they moved together through the snow-covered woods, a silent partnership. Hours passed as they ventured deeper into the forest. The storm had left its mark on the land. Trees were bent under the weight of snow, and the world around them was blanketed in a cold, frozen silence. Joseph paused several times, calling out to see if there was any sign of the missing puppies. Each time Haven remained still, her head cocked slightly, listening intently. But there was nothing, no response. The forest seemed empty, untouched by life. Just as Joseph began to feel the sting of uncertainty creeping in, Haven stopped. She lifted her head, sniffing the air, her eyes narrowing. Joseph felt a shiver of hope rush through him. He stepped forward cautiously, following her lead. Haven's body language was focused, intent. She was leading him somewhere. As they pushed further through the woods, they came upon a small clearing. Joseph's heart skipped when he saw it. A faint trail of paw prints in the snow. The prints were small, too small to be Haven's. They were the tracks of puppies, the same tiny paws that had walked with her in the storm. He crouched down to examine the trail, his hands shaking slightly. This was it. They were close. But as he scanned the area, a sinking feeling hit him. There was something about the tracks, something wrong. The prints were scattered, as if the puppies had wandered off in different directions. The wind had covered some of the trails, making it hard to tell where they had gone. Joseph felt his pulse quicken. The search was far from over, but with Haven beside him and the faint hope that they were close, he knew he couldn't stop now. The snow crunched underfoot as Joseph followed the faint trail of paw prints, each step pulling him further into the unknown. Haven moved beside him, her eyes focused on the ground ahead, her instincts guiding them with quiet determination. The storm had cleared, but the tension in the air remained. Joseph's heart pounded in his chest and his breath came out in visible puffs mixing with the cold. He couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. The trail of prints led them through a dense stretch of trees, their bare branches scraping against the sky like fingers reaching for something beyond the storm. It was quiet here, too quiet. The sound of the wind, which had once been so deafening, had now faded, leaving only the whisper of their footsteps in the snow. Haven's pace slowed as they reached the edge of the forest. Joseph's eyes scanned the horizon, the weight of the search pressing down on him. And then in the distance, something caught his eye. A small building barely visible through the trees stood like a shadow against the snow-covered ground. Its weathered wood and faded signs made it look abandoned, but something about it felt different. The sight struck Joseph like a bolt of lightning. This was it. This was what they had been searching for. He pushed forward, Haven following closely, her eyes locked on the building as they drew nearer. The paw prints, though faint, seemed to lead directly toward it, and Joseph's hope swelled. He could feel it now. The pull of destiny. This was no accident. This was where they were meant to be. As they approached the building, Joseph's mind raced. Could this be a shelter, a place for dogs maybe, a rescue center? As they neared, Haven's ears perked up, her body language becoming more alert, as if she recognized the place. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her tail held low but steady. Joseph reached the door first, his heart racing. He paused for a moment, taking in the weathered sign that hung above the entrance, Valor Canine Training Center. The name hit him like a wave of realization. Valor. The word was both a reminder of the strength he had found in Haven and the promise he had made to protect her. And now it seemed they had found something more. something that would help them fulfill their mission. He pushed the door open carefully, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the space was warm, filled with the smell of cedar and freshly cut wood. There were kennels lined up along one wall with a few dogs inside, some lying quietly while others paced restlessly. The space had been designed for the training of working dogs, Joseph could tell, and as his eyes scanned the room, a sense of calm washed over him. This was a place for healing. This was a place where dogs like Haven could find a purpose once again. A voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "Can I help you?" a woman called out, stepping into view. She was tall, with dark braided hair and a calm, steady presence. She wore a worn leather vest over a simple shirt, and her face was lined with the wisdom of someone who had worked with animals for years. Joseph stepped forward, his voice steady, but filled with a sense of urgency. "I think we found a place for her," he said, motioning to Haven. The woman's eyes immediately fell on Haven, and a soft smile tugged at her lips. She stepped closer, kneeling down to meet Haven's gaze. "She's a strong one," she said, her voice soft but full of understanding. "What's her name, Haven?" Joseph replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And this little one," he added, looking down at the puppies, "is Valor." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes gleaming with understanding. "It looks like they found their way home," she said, glancing back at Joseph. "This place is for dogs like her, dogs who have served, who need a new mission. If she's ready, we can help her heal, and help you too." Joseph felt a weight lift from his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for. It wasn't just about protecting Haven and the puppies anymore. It was about giving them a future where they could all find purpose again, where they could heal together. And in that future, Joseph saw hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of purpose, a purpose Joseph hadn't realized he had been missing for so long. As the woman, Grace, as Joseph had learned her name, helped them get settled into Valor Canine Training Center, Joseph knew something important was starting. This wasn't just a temporary solution, it was a new beginning. Haven, Valor, and the other dogs would no longer be lost, no longer wandering. They would have a place, a mission, and so would he. Joseph found himself working alongside Grace, putting together plans to transform the space into a full-fledged training center. There were long hours spent in the small but cozy workshop, building new kennels, installing training equipment, and setting up rooms for therapy and rehabilitation. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a beacon of hope, not just for Haven and her pups, but for soldiers and service dogs who had given their all. The idea was simple but powerful: to create a place where both the soldiers who had returned home from war and the dogs who had fought beside them could heal together. Joseph had seen the toll war took on soldiers, and he knew it was no different for the dogs who served beside them. These dogs were more than just animals, they were heroes too. They had witnessed the horrors of war, carried the weight of their missions, and often returned with scars, both visible and invisible. As the weeks passed, Joseph poured his energy into the center. With Haven by his side, always at the ready, and Valor growing stronger with each passing day, the facility began to take shape. It wasn't just a training center for dogs, it was a sanctuary. There was a sense of peace that settled over the place, an unspoken understanding that the trauma of the past was not to be ignored, but to be faced and healed. This was where the healing would begin. Haven spent her days training with the other dogs, regaining the skills she had once mastered, and Joseph worked alongside them, offering guidance to both the dogs and the veterans. There was a camaraderie that was born out of shared experiences, the same loyalty, the same unspoken bond. As Joseph worked with Haven, he realized just how much she had taught him, not just about survival, but about resilience. Every day he saw it in the way she held herself, in the way she worked with the other dogs, in the way she healed herself and in turn healed him. The dogs that came through Camp Valor were a mix of service dogs, military dogs, and rescue animals. Some had scars from battle, others from neglect, but all of them shared the same need to find a new purpose, a place to belong. And that's what Joseph was offering them, a place to find meaning again, a place where they could heal and move forward. Joseph stood outside one evening looking over the camp he had helped build, a camp that was slowly becoming a home for both the dogs and the soldiers who came through. The sunset bathed the camp in warm golden light, and the sound of dogs barking and playing filled the air. Haven and Valor stood at his side, their eyes watching the camp with a quiet sense of pride. He couldn't help but smile. This place, this Camp Valor, was more than just a training center. It was a second chance. A place where soldiers and dogs could find healing, find peace, and find a new beginning. And in that moment, Joseph knew that this was where he was meant to be. He had found his purpose again, not just in protecting Haven and her puppies, but in giving back. The work was just beginning, but Joseph felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was where he could make a difference. This was where Haven, Valor, and the others could find their place in the world, and, in doing so, heal not just themselves, but the wounded souls of those who had fought beside them. The days at Camp Valor had settled into a steady rhythm. What once felt like a distant dream had now become a tangible reality. The camp was alive with purpose, filled with the sounds of barking dogs and the murmurs of soldiers working side by side with their canine companions. The air was always thick with anticipation, as both the animals and their human partners prepared for what was ahead. Haven had regained much of her strength, though the scars of her past were still evident in the way she moved. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a teacher, guiding the other dogs with a quiet authority. Her patience was unbroken, her protective nature undiminished by the toll the journey had taken on her. As the days passed, Joseph noticed how the dogs, particularly the puppies, were becoming more than just animals under his care. They were beginning to learn to grow and, most importantly, to trust. The first group of lessons had been simple: basic commands, hand signals, and the art of patience. But as time went on, the lessons became more complex. Each day, Joseph and the soldiers worked together with the dogs, developing bonds of trust and understanding that went beyond words. The soldiers learned how to communicate with the dogs using their eyes, their body language, and their calm demeanor. It wasn't just about giving orders, it was about building relationships, earning trust, and becoming a team. Haven was particularly good at this. She had a natural gift for reading people, understanding their needs and their weaknesses. She worked closely with the veterans who came to the camp, many of whom were still haunted by the memories of war. Joseph watched as Haven slowly bridged the gap between the soldiers and the trauma they carried. With each interaction, the veterans began to open up, sharing their experiences with the dogs in a way they never had with other people. Haven had a way of listening without judgment, of being present without demanding anything in return. She had been through the worst, and yet here she was, offering her strength and loyalty to those who needed it most. The puppies, now growing stronger by the day, were beginning their training as well. They followed Haven's example, learning to stay calm under pressure, to sit to stay, and to trust the soldiers. At first, the puppies were hesitant, their small bodies shaking in the face of new experiences. But with each small success, their confidence grew. Valor was the first to show a natural aptitude for his role. His energy was boundless, and his curiosity knew no limits. He quickly bonded with one of the soldiers, a young man named Coleman, who had returned from a deployment in the Middle East. The bond between Valor and Coleman was instant. Coleman had been struggling with PTSD, and Valor seemed to sense that. He stayed close to Coleman, offering comfort in ways that no one else could. Joseph couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he watched them. The dogs were no longer just puppies. They were becoming soldiers in their own right, learning to serve, to protect, and to heal. And the soldiers, in turn, were learning to heal as well. The camp had become a sanctuary for both the dogs and the men and women who came to find peace. In those first lessons, Joseph realized something important. This wasn't just about training dogs or soldiers. This was about healing broken hearts and mending the wounds that time could never fully erase. Camp Valor was a place where the past was acknowledged, but it didn't define the future. It was a place where both the dogs and the soldiers could find a new mission, a new purpose. They could heal together, and in doing so, rebuild their lives. Joseph felt a deep sense of accomplishment knowing that Haven had brought him to this point. The camp was thriving, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that Maybe, just maybe, they were all on the right path. As the days passed at Camp Valor, Joseph found himself stepping into a role he had never anticipated. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He had become a teacher, a mentor, someone who could help others heal, not just through the lessons he imparted, but through the example set by Haven and the bond they shared. Together, Haven and Joseph began to teach lessons that transcended traditional dog training. They weren't just teaching obedience or skills. They were teaching loyalty, trust, and sacrifice. Joseph had always known that Haven was more than just a rescue dog, but now, as they worked with the soldiers and their canine companions, he saw the true depth of her strength. She had a unique way of showing the men and women that loyalty wasn't just something that existed between humans and dogs. It was something that could be shared among all living beings, no matter their past. Each day, Haven worked alongside Joseph, demonstrating through her actions what true commitment looked like. She never faltered in her dedication to her puppies, and that same dedication extended to the soldiers who came to Camp Valor for help. Haven's quiet, constant presence was the perfect contrast to the chaotic energy that often filled the camp. She had a way of calming the soldiers, of showing them that they weren't alone in their struggles. She had been through her own battles, and yet she continued to give and give, asking for nothing in return. Joseph watched as Haven helped the soldiers to connect with their dogs. There were veterans who had been carrying the weight of war on their shoulders for years, their eyes hollow with the pain of memories they couldn't escape. But when they interacted with Haven and the puppies, there was a shift, a light in their eyes that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long while, they were reminded of what it meant to trust, to be loyal, and to love again. One particular day, Joseph stood alongside Haven as she worked with Coleman, the young soldier who had been paired with Valor. Coleman had been struggling with the haunting memories of a war that had taken so much from him. He had pushed everyone away, including his own family. But Valor had a way of breaking through his walls. The dog had become his lifeline, his anchor to reality. And as Haven watched them, Joseph saw the same thing in her eyes. A deep understanding of the unspoken bond that was forming between the soldier and the dog. Joseph turned to Haven, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "You're teaching them," he whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes calm, but he knew she understood. She had taught him too, how to let go of the pain, how to trust again, and how to be present. As the day went on, Haven continued to guide the others with her gentle strength, her calmness, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the soldiers' inner battles. Joseph couldn't help but marvel at the way she had transformed the camp, how her presence had brought about so much healing, not just for the dogs, but for the soldiers too. The lessons of loyalty, sacrifice, and love that Haven imparted were no longer just lessons of survival. They were lessons of rebirth. Each dog and soldier who passed through the camp was given a chance to start anew. They were allowed to grieve their losses, to heal their wounds, and to move forward side by side with their canine companions. In the quiet moments when the camp was still and the puppies were resting, Joseph would sit beside Haven, feeling the weight of the past lift with every breath. He was no longer the man he had been when he first arrived. The pain that had defined him for so long was fading, replaced by the warmth of connection, the comfort of purpose, and the quiet certainty that he wasn't alone anymore. The morning sun rose over Camp Valor, casting a soft, golden light over the newly established training grounds. The air, still crisp from the remnants of the storm, felt fresh, filled with the promise of a new beginning. The camp, once just an idea, born from pain and loss, had grown into something real, something full of life. Joseph stood at the edge of the training yard, looking out at the small patch of land that had become a sanctuary for the soldiers and the dogs who sought healing. Haven and Valor were by his side, the familiar warmth of their presence settling into his bones. Haven, once a dog on the brink of exhaustion, was now strong, her posture proud and alert. Her eyes, though still holding traces of the hardship she had endured, now gleamed with something else: peace, purpose, and the quiet strength that came from knowing she had fulfilled her mission. Valor, her young son, had grown into a strong and confident pup. His energy was boundless, but there was an innate calmness to him as well. He had inherited the best qualities of both his mother and his surroundings: courage, resilience, and an unwavering loyalty to those who needed him most. Together, the three of them had found a rhythm in the quiet, steady work of healing, of learning, and of rebuilding. The future, once uncertain and clouded by grief, now felt full of possibility. Joseph couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. Just a few months ago, he had been a man consumed by the weight of loss and loneliness. The memories of the war, the pain of losing Nathan, and the hollow emptiness left by his wife's passing had threatened to swallow him whole. But now, with Haven Valor and the camp that had blossomed around them, Joseph had found his place again. The path that had once been so unclear had revealed itself to him step by step, like a trail leading out of the darkness into the light. The soldiers who came to Camp Valor had found the same solace. Some had come seeking purpose, others healing, but all had found it. Haven had shown them how to trust again, how to open their hearts after years of battle, both external and internal. Valor had brought a spark of joy to the soldiers who had long forgotten what it felt like to smile without guilt. And Joseph, in his role as a guide, had begun to understand that he wasn't just helping the soldiers and the dogs. He was healing too. The camp had become a community, a family, of people who had seen the worst of life yet found a way to move forward together. It wasn't just a place for soldiers and dogs, it was a place for redemption. For the first time in a long while, Joseph felt like he had found his calling, a way to give back, a way to create something lasting out of the pain and loss that had once defined him. As he watched Haven and Valor interact with the soldiers, guiding them through the training exercises, Joseph felt a warmth settle over him. This was what it meant to be alive again, to share the journey with those who understood the weight of sacrifice and the power of redemption. Haven glanced back at him, her amber eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. In that look, Joseph saw the completion of the circle that had begun with their first meeting. Haven had saved him, but in doing so, they had both found something even more valuable, a purpose, a new life, and a future that was waiting to be written. Joseph smiled as he watched the sun rise higher in the sky, its light stretching across the training yard. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Haven Valor and the camp that had become their home. And with each new day, he knew they were all walking forward together towards a future filled with hope and possibility. As the story of Haven and Valor unfolds, it serves as a powerful reminder of the deep, unspoken bond between humans and animals, particularly the German shepherds, who have long been symbols of loyalty, courage, and unwavering commitment. Haven's journey from a mother fighting for her puppies to a protector, finding a new purpose, mirrors the healing process many of us experience in the face of adversity. It speaks to the transformative power of love, compassion, and second chances. Through Haven and Valor, we see that animals are not just companions, but partners in our healing, our growth, and our journey forward. They show us the strength and resilience in loyalty and in selfless love. Just as Haven had her mission to fulfill, we all have a purpose to live out. The healing power of animals, particularly service dogs, is evident in the way Valor and his fellow K9s work alongside soldiers and veterans, helping them find peace and rebuild their lives. This story encourages us to recognize the value of love and care, not just for animals, but for all life. It teaches us that healing doesn't come from isolation, but through connection, whether it's with a furry friend or with those who understand our struggles. As we reflect on Haven and Valor's story, we are reminded of the positive impact animals have on our lives and the incredible strength that comes from their love and loyalty. May we all learn to embrace the lessons of unconditional love, sacrifice, and the healing power of animals as they teach us to be better, stronger, and more compassionate every day.